will happen. That depends on people. And as in any other country, as in the United States, as in any other country, safety and security of nuclear weapons depends on people. And you must and you have to find reliable people. And there are reliable people in Russia. It's frankly, I would not say it's very much, but somehow, to some extent, that offend me when I hear that that is unfair approach to suspect each and one Russian in being unreliable, in going to sell its motherland, in going to be corrupted, and so on and so on. I cannot reassure you. We just need reliable people, and we do have some reliable people, and that is the only and the main our hope.
Does that sound reassuring to you? And that's the Russian point of view. That's the most positive spin that you're going to get on this problem.
In terms of the Russians, the doctors have a very strong affiliate in Russia and access to many key decision makers. In fact, quite a number of our doctors are actually members of the Russian Duma, the parliament. And they're very much aware of the problems of smuggling and the problems of soldiers not having been paid, and the people who are protecting the missiles are unreliable, and so on. And I'm sure you've also heard the story of the Norwegian weather missile that was fired. It was an American missile fired from Norway on the 25th of January 1995, and it was heading toward Russia. And they had announced it to the Russian officials. They'd sent letters to say, don't worry, this is just a weather missile, nothing serious going on here. But there is such poor communication in the Russian system that the message didn't get carried to the top. And as a result, the military people picked up this missile coming toward them on their radar screen and said, we're under attack. And for the first time in history, they took that command suitcase to Boris Yeltsin, and he had about 6 minutes to decide whether Russia was under attack from the United States and should send all of its missiles back headed toward the US, or whether it was something else.
And just in case you're not completely convinced yet, let's make this perfectly clear. How safe are Russia's nuclear weapons?
I think we have to be very concerned about the safety of nuclear weapons in Russia on a number of different levels. The first concern is the command and control of the weapons themselves. We do not have a lot of confidence in the command and control capabilities of the Russian nuclear system. It was true that during the Cold War it was reasonably effective, but we're not sure about how effective it is now. And so we're worried about unauthorized release. That is to say that nuclear weapons will be used or accidentally, or they will be used with the authority of someone who is not in political control in Russia. The second area we're concerned about is that the actual weapons themselves will fall into the hands of sub-state actors and be sold abroad or transferred abroad. That's probably a low probability but high risk scenario. It's unlikely to happen, but the consequences are obviously quite enormous. The third thing we're concerned about with the safety of Russian nuclear weapons is whether or not the experts, the actual brain power, the scientists, the technicians, are really in a position to transfer their knowledge abroad, either by working abroad in other countries, or in fact by using their knowledge to obtain employment in other countries.
Is Russia the main problem? I don't think so. I mean, everybody has to take cognizance of the danger that exists because of the so-called loose nukes in Russia, because of the trained scientists who could sell their capabilities to others, and because of the weapons-grade fissionable material that could get away from Russian control. Now, all that having been said, of course, the United States must be the country that shows leadership on this.
It will be essential that the Americans take the lead, but it will be essential that they conduct it in a way, they conduct any such negotiation in a way which respects the sensitivities of the Russians, and particularly of the Russian military. And that's not going to be at all easy. To get the Russians to accept the kind of world that I've been describing will not be easy, and it will require the Americans, I think, probably to move sooner rather than later. I get very nervous when I look at the prospect of a Russia which is disarming involuntarily and sees its military capability just evaporating and getting nothing back for it.
And what about America? It's the only remaining superpower. It's the biggest, richest, toughest kid on the block. With power comes responsibility, right? So it follows that the ultimate responsibility rests with the most powerful nation in the world. But if America is afraid to get rid of its nukes, how can we expect anybody else to do it? Of course, America is much more than its government. There are a lot of people in America who do feel strongly that the U.S. nuclear policy must change. A growing number of foundations, organizations, and private citizens are coming forward to push the U.S. to scrap its nuclear weapons. At a recent conference in Santa Barbara, California, representatives of many of these groups gathered for a strategy session. And like the delegates in Victoria, these people are committed to finding solutions to a complex, difficult, but urgent problem.
I think we all have a lot of good intentions, and I think we have to form some structure. For a long time, the Democrats suffered in terms of fundraising and were awed at how well the Republicans over all the years, because they had great managerial skills and structure. We're fortunate enough to have a general here who has, as he said earlier, is a strategist and has a sense of organization. And I think we need to find someone, at least informally, on us, and not necessarily on a letterhead, who can help allocate the areas that we can be the most specific in.
At the end of the strategy session, the delegates took time to honor General Lee Butler, former head of the U.S. Strategic Air Command. As commander of SAC, he was responsible for the entire vast American nuclear machine, the thousands of crew members, the systems they operated, and the warheads those systems were designed to deliver. He was also the principal nuclear advisor to the President of the United States, and that meant that at any given moment, on any given day, he had to be within 3 rings of his telephone and prepared to answer the following question. General, the nation is under nuclear attack. I must decide in minutes how to respond. What is your recommendation with regard to the nature of our reply? This man, whose finger was closer to the button than anyone except the President himself, has become an ardent advocate for the cause of getting rid of nuclear weapons.
General Butler brings great hope and a great challenge to us. You'll hear him speak in a moment, but General Butler is a man who has worked at the very core of nuclear weapons strategy and nuclear war planning in this country. And he's worked to try and diminish the threat. And after retiring from the military in 1994, he has become a man who has spoken out passionately and eloquently for the elimination of nuclear weapons from the earth. I can't tell you how important his presence and his willingness to take this stand is in motivating people all over the world.
This is a patriot who continues to serve the best interests of civilization. Lee's choice to make nuclear abolition his life's commitment has dramatically influenced many of us to commit ourselves with increased enthusiasm and energy. Lee continues living his life protecting our country, but his beliefs on how to achieve security have dramatically changed. For years, as head of the Strategic Air Command, he planned the ultimate destruction. Now, he tirelessly labors to prevent that destruction. A man willing to change based on reason and conscience is the kind of man who can change history.
My critique of the United States as a nuclear weapons power can be properly understood only in the context of that broader role. By clinging to the extreme precepts of Cold War nuclear deterrence, we erode the respect for life that anchors our sense of humanity and the moral sensibilities that increasingly inspire us to contain the violence of war and the suffering of innocents. Worse, with respect to the central issue of proliferation, we risk summoning the very nightmare we have worked so fervently to forestall. first-use policies and high-alert postures are in direct contradiction to our self-interest, to the objectives of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and to the patent rejection of the use of nuclear weapons by American presidents in conflicts from Korea to Indochina to the Persian Gulf.
General Butler's conversion from pro-nuclear weapons to anti-nuclear weapons is a hopeful sign for the future. It raises the possibility that other powerful people in Washington may also come to see the madness of nuclear foreign policy.
In the United States, there was a president of the United States that said, we must rid the world of nuclear weapons, and that is going to be my primary goal. It would happen. So, I mean, it could happen that easily, and it's a matter of bringing the pressure to bear and bringing somebody into that office that has the vision and the foresight to understand that we can't go on indefinitely believing that we can base our national security on threatening to destroy most of the world.
But it's important to point out that not only does U.S. policy threaten to destroy us all in the future, it's affecting our health right now. In fact, right now, real people are dying as a result of the U.S. nuclear policy. And the people who are dying the most are U.S. citizens.
I was born in late 1950 next to the Hanford Nuclear Weapons Facility in Washington State, southeastern Washington State, where my father was a nuclear engineer. So I was conceived, I was in utero, an infant and a child during years of massive radioiodine emissions, that's radioactive iodine, from the plant, because that is where they produced the plutonium that was used for the trigger of the bomb detonated over Nagasaki. And people like myself were exposed to hundreds of radioactive radionuclides, and radioiodine goes to the thyroid and the parathyroids. I have severe thyroid disease, severe parathyroid problems. I have osteonecrosis, which is bone death. I'm just going to summarize this so you can see the impact on a family like mine. My father died of rapidly metastatic thyroid cancer 3 years ago. My mother died of a rare form of malignant melanoma 5 weeks ago. My brother died in the Hanford Downwind area in 1947, and he's part of a study now by the U.S. Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry on neonatal deaths.
Tricia's family is only one of millions affected by the U.S. nuclear weapons program. In fact, the throat area incision scar from having a cancerous thyroid gland removed is so common among people who live near Hanford, the familiar scar has become known as the Hanford necklace.
Well, this also includes Canada, which is fascinating. The Hanford Nuclear Reservation exposed potentially 2 million people to radioiodine. That's airborne radioiodine, which was the byproduct of plutonium production. Those emissions went into Canada, western Montana, Idaho, the eastern portion of Washington State, and Oregon. 2 million people, that includes many Canadians. The Nevada test site exposures, which took place from the bomb tests in the 1950s, that radioiodine went into Canada and went all across the United States. It was widely dispersed. It wasn't just radioiodine. And there are hot spots, including in Canada, where people, they need to know they were exposed. They need to be watched for thyroid cancer. They need to be watched and helped with the other thyroid outcomes. It's not a U.S. problem. It's a U.S. and a Canada problem, and it's a global problem.
Tricia Pritikin's story raises two very important concerns. First, there is no such thing as a safe level of radiation exposure, period. And second, if the U.S. government, the most powerful political force in the world, won't even protect its own citizens or those of its allies from the dangers of preparing for nuclear war, how can we expect them to take concrete steps towards preventing future catastrophe? And if they won't even help their own, how can we expect them to save the world? Is there really any room for hope? The governments of the nuclear nations have not made great strides lately in the area of nuclear disarmament. It often seems that despite the huge expense and minimal military value of these weapons, governments that possess nuclear weapons don't want to part with them. They often say they're defending the interests of their citizens. But as it happens, the citizens themselves don't agree. Polls reveal that 87% of Americans, the same percentage of Britons, and a whopping 93% of Canadians want a global ban on nuclear weapons. So if that many people want change in countries that are supposed to be democracies, What's the problem?
The only answer to your question is if the politicians themselves lead the debate, if they see advantage in explaining these issues to the public and carrying the public with them.
What I think is the biggest problem is that the public has been lulled into complacency because we thought with the end of the Cold War that was it, that we didn't have to worry anymore. I personally thought at last the weapons, especially when they said, oh, they're detargeted, I thought, oh great, now we have some time to work on this issue and it's relatively safe, we're going to be okay. That, in fact, was not the case.
If they were asked on a scale of 1 to 10 what they think are the most important issues to them personally, for their security, for their well-being, you wouldn't see nuclear weapons on there anywhere. So when they're asked the question blindly, they say, sure, we support it, but when they're asked what's important to them, it's education, it's social security, it's taxes, it's the environment, it's all these other issues, and national security is nowhere on the list. So that's the difference, and how it translates to politicians is that they pay attention to what they get in their offices. You know, what are they hearing about from their constituents? And so if they're not getting any information from their constituents because their constituents don't think that's one of the 10 most important things that they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis, then a member of Congress will turn to me and say, I'm not getting any mail on this. Even on a treaty like the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, they're not getting any mail. So they don't think it's important to their constituents. They're not going to take a position on it.
There you have it. Holding in an opinion in a democracy just isn't enough. You have to be willing to back up your opinion with action. Marching in the streets, letter writing, civil disobedience. That's the only way to really affect your country's policies. But is it even worth it to fight for change if your country doesn't have any nuclear weapons? If it's not a military or economic superpower? If it's a country like, well, like Canada?
Canada is bound by the fact that we share a continent with the United States and that Canada is in effect strategic territory for the United States. And that limits inevitably the degree to which we can be independent. That said, when we have taken independent initiatives over the years, they have proven often to be very important. Who can forget the ultimate importance of peacekeeping begun by Mike Pearson? The Landmines Initiative is going to be, I predict, an important one and has focused the international community not just on landmines per se, but on a whole series of issues surrounding what Mr. Axworthy calls human security. The notion that security is not just security for countries, for political regimes, but security for people.
I think Canada is in position to encourage the United States, I could say, to be more forthcoming about constraints on nuclear weapons. It's a natural role for Canada to play. You do understand us better, I think, than any other country for obvious reasons, but you have an independent perspective. And those are real assets. And there's intimate engagement on matters of security between the two countries. So Canada has been in a position to be, if you will, a moral conscience, and a stimulus to imagination.
Canada could be a leading nation in the movement toward a world free of nuclear weapons. Canada, of course, is a member of NATO. Canada has a good, friendly relationship with the United States. If the government of Canada would stand up and say, we will no longer be part of an alliance that bases security on nuclear weapons, that's our moral position, that's our committed position, that's what we want to say to the world, I think that message would resonate in Washington and in London and in Paris and in Moscow. I mean, Canada could be the brave leader that moves the world toward the elimination of nuclear weapons.
The short answer is yes, Canada can make a difference. And that difference can be magnified if Canada can band together with like-minded other nations of similar stature. The middle powers, as they're called. So let's look into this idea of the middle powers.
The Middle Powers Initiative, led by Ambassador Doug Roach and his very competent staff, has already scored a major success. I was privileged to play a small role in this activity as pertained to its Canadian dimension, and it's seen at close hand the product of Doug's intelligent and focused leadership.
Because it brings together 8 prominent international organizations that specialize in nuclear disarmament, and it has an entree into governments at very high levels. And thus we are bridging, so to speak, the immense networks of non-governmental organizations that have been working in nuclear disarmament for a long time with governments that are actually setting the policies. And the MPI is still a rather tender plant, I would say, and it still needs nourishing as it's poked its head up above the ground. But already the success that we have had in reaching key governments is notable and promising for the future.
The MPI called the Middle Power Initiative because it was decided, it was originated by Pugwash in Canada, and then it was picked up by Doug Roche and some other people who've formed the Middle Powers Initiative with Canadians and Americans. I was one of the original people that joined Doug Roche in creating it, and I'm on the steering committee. We felt that significant powers, not the biggest but also not the smallest, could have influence on the United States and the other nuclear powers if they began to tell them, we promise not to get nuclear weapons, but you promise to get rid of them. We haven't got them, but you still got yours. You should shape up and keep your promise. We felt the countries that are influential in the world, although not the biggest or the smallest, could have impact.
Yes, Canada can play a role in making this a safer world. Canada can take advantage of that special relationship it has with the U.S., and it can work with other middle powers. As well, it can be a strong voice for change in NATO. In particular, the Canadian government needs to keep the pressure on the U.S. After all, they're the most powerful nation on the planet. And if they don't take this nuclear threat seriously and really do something about it, well, then we're all pretty much sunk.
Up until now, many of those states have been too frightened to challenge, and they've been bullied. Now, actually, the bullying to New Zealanders actually made us stronger and made us more convinced that we were right, and strengthened the backbone of most of our politicians.
And those of us who know what's happening have to get out there and let everybody else know about it.
I think the main thing is for the public, first of all, obviously to understand the issue and what's at play here. And then secondly, to make their views known. And they'll make their views known through members of parliament, make their views known through letters to the editor. They'll make their views known in public meetings of one kind or another. And that, to my mind, is extremely important, and governments will listen.
The first major impediment to change is just lack of knowledge. And that goes both on the part of the public, but also the part of the non-governmental organizations that are working to create change. We need a base of technical knowledge, and we need a base of political knowledge and strategic knowledge. So that's the first thing. The second is the public, and getting the information out to the public. But knowing something and acting on it is totally different. And so you not only need to inform people, but you need to mobilize them, you need to activate, you need to inspire them to actually create change. And ultimately, and this is the biggest impediment to change, is you want to influence the elites, the policymakers.
To have civilization depending for security by major nations on nuclear weapons and the threat of terror with those weapons is a very poor way for civilization to behave. It's unworthy of humanity. And it's not only a practical matter of avoiding extermination and catastrophe, but it's a moral issue. It's a spiritual issue. It's a meaning of life issue. And part of that gives me confidence that we will make it, that people will realize that this is not an appropriate way for people to grow up and live and seek to live, and that probably this contributes to the violence that goes on in the world.
While recognizing the enormity of the task, I have, in my own mind, no choice but to express not just a blind optimism, but a sense of hope. And my sense of hope does come from higher elevation of humanity, the grotesque atrocities that dominate the daily headlines notwithstanding. And so I get my sense of hope by a human way also. It isn't just a lot of textbooks or the abstractions of this issue or all the political wars that I'm in. I get my sense of hope when I hold my little grandchildren in my arms. And these little tiny human beings, you know, I look down into their eyes and I say to them, you know, I just have to do something better for you, so you're going to have a world that will be free of the weapons of mass destruction.
This problem is so huge and terrifying that it's tempting to just ignore it and hope that it'll take care of itself. But if we do that, it's a sure bet that sooner or later, well, you know how urgent the situation really is. So what are you going to do now?
This program has been produced through the Simons Foundation. The Simons Foundation actively promotes education in peace, disarmament, and global cooperation.